Hello everyone, I'm Amanda Landers, the Conservation Chair of the Daughters of the American Revolution, SVC, and today I will present information on monarch waystations and plant selection for pollinators. On July 21st, 2022, the monarch butterfly was added to the International Union for the Conservation of Nature's Red List of threatened species as endangered, threatened by habitat destruction and climate change. Pesticides and herbicides used in intensive agriculture across the Americas kill butterflies and milkweed, the host plant that the larvae of the monarch butterfly feed on. Climate change has significantly impacted the migratory monarch butterfly and is a fast-growing threat. Drought limits the growth of the milkweed and increases the frequency of catastrophic wildfires, and temperature extremes are triggering earlier migrations before milkweed is available. Each fall, we expect hundreds of millions of monarch butterflies to migrate from the United States and Canada to central Mexico, where they wait out the winter until conditions favor a return flight in the spring. Monarch waystations are places that provide resources necessary for monarchs to produce successive generations and sustain their migration. Without available milkweeds throughout their spring and summer breeding areas in North America, monarchs would not be able to produce the successive generations that culminate in the migration each fall. Similarly, without nectar from flowers, these fall migratory monarch butterflies would be unable to make their long journey to overwintering grounds in Mexico. The need for host plants for larvae and energy sources for adults applies to all monarch and butterfly populations around the world. Milkweeds and nectar sources are declining due to development and the widespread use of herbicides in croplands, pastures, and roadsides. Because 90% of all milkweed grows within the agricultural landscape, farm practices have the potential to strongly influence monarch populations. Development of subdivisions, factories, shopping centers, etc. in the U.S. is consuming habitats for monarchs at the rate of about 6,000 acres or 9.4 square miles per day. This is roughly equivalent to losing an area of habitat the size of the state of Illinois every 16 years. Widespread adoption of herbicide-resistant corn and soybeans has resulted in the loss of more than 100 million acres of monarch habitat in recent years. The planting of these crops, genetically modified to resist the non-selective systemic herbicide glyphosate, commonly known as Roundup, allows growers to spray fields with this herbicide instead of tilling to control weeds. Milkweeds survive tilling, but not the repeated use of glyphosate. This habitat loss is substantial since these croplands represent a significant portion of the summer breeding area for monarchs. The use of herbicides and frequent mowing along roadsides has converted much of this habitat to grassy areas that lack shelter and food for wildlife. Although some states have started to increase the diversity of plantings, including milkweeds, along roadsides, these programs are small. Unfortunately, the remaining milkweed habitats in pastures, hayfields, edges of forests, grasslands, native prairies, and urban areas are not sufficient to sustain the large monarch butterfly populations seen in earlier decades. To offset the loss of milkweeds and nectar sources, we need to create, conserve, and protect monarch butterfly habitats. You can help by creating monarch waystations in home gardens, at schools, businesses, parks, zoos, nature centers, along roadsides, and on other unused plots of land. Creating a monarch waystation can be as simple as adding milkweeds and nectar sources to existing gardens, or maintaining natural habitats with milkweeds. No effort is too small to have a positive impact. By creating and maintaining a monarch waystation, you are contributing to monarch conservation, an effort that will help assure the preservation of the species and the continuation of the spectacular monarch migration phenomenon. I'll share some guidelines for waystations. Size. A suitable monarch waystation habitat can be easily integrated into an existing garden. There is no minimum area requirement in order to certify your habitat. However, a truly effective monarch waystation will be at least 100 square feet. The total area may be split among several discrete sites at your location. There is no upper limit for the size of a monarch waystation habitat. Exposure. Butterflies and nectar plants need lots of sun, therefore, monarch waystations need to be located in an area that receives at least 6 hours of sunlight each day. Drainage and soil type. Milkweeds and nectar plants will do best in relatively light, low clay soils. Good drainage is needed to avoid root rot and provide good aeration for roots. Shelter. To assure that the maximum number of monarchs survive in your habitat, the plants should be relatively close together. However, they should not be crowded. Be sure to follow the planting guide specific to each plant. All monarch life stages need shelter from predators and the elements. Planting milkweeds and other nectar plants close together contributes to this shelter for monarchs and other wildlife. Milkweed plants. To maximize the use of your habitat by monarchs, you should have at least 10 milkweed plants made up of 2 or more species. However, a large number of plants, more than 10, of one species is sufficient. Milkweeds of different species mature and flower at different times during the season. By increasing the number of milkweed species in your habitat, you will increase the likelihood that monarchs will utilize your property for a longer period during the breeding season. Nectar plants. Monarchs, other butterflies, and numerous pollinators need nectar. By providing nectar sources that bloom sequentially or continuously throughout the season, your monarch waystation can provide resources for monarchs throughout the breeding season and the migration in fall. A monarch waystation should contain several annual, biennial, and perennial plants that provide nectar for butterflies, such as butterfly bushes, liatris, cosmos, asters, zinnias, coneflowers, alliums, goldenrod, black-eyed Susans, sage, and lavender. Management. You should have a plan to sustain a monarch waystation. Specific actions you take will depend on the features of your habitat. However, some general examples include mulching, thinning, fertilizing, amending the soil, removing dead stalks, watering, eliminating insecticide use, removing invasive plant species, and incorporating additional features. Be sure to register your waystation at monarchwatch.org and encourage others to follow in your footsteps. Monarch Watch is a nonprofit educational outreach program based at the University of Kansas that focuses on the monarch butterfly, its habitat, and its spectacular fall migration. To show your support of monarch conservation, you can have your monarch habitat certified as an official monarch waystation by Monarch Watch. Your habitat will be included in the Monarch Waystation Registry, an online listing of monarch waystations worldwide, and you will be awarded a certificate bearing your name and your habitat's unique Monarch Waystation ID number. You may also choose to purchase a metal sign that identifies your monarch habitat as an official monarch waystation. This display helps convey this important monarch conservation message to all those who visit your habitat and may encourage them to create their own monarch waystation. As of October 9, 2022, there are 41,397 monarch waystation habitats registered with Monarch Watch. Plant selection for pollinators, native versus non-native species. Now I will talk about a topic that many gardeners feel strongly about, using native plants in our gardens and landscapes. On the surface, it seems like a no-brainer. We should choose plants that are native to our local environment because they are adapted to those conditions. We will dig a little deeper into this perception and see whether or not it is supported by science. Before we go much further, though, I want to mention that the soils that are currently present in your yard or a company's property are quite different from those in which your region's native plants evolved. And you're most likely now living in an urbanized area which is nothing like whatever ecosystem was originally there. These significant environmental differences will affect how well native plant species will tolerate your landscape conditions. First, let's define exactly what native means, because it's a bit trickier than you might think. Then we'll elaborate on some of the perceived benefits of using native rather than introduced species. One of the most frequently stated benefits is that the native plants support native animals, meaning that yards and landscapes are more biodiverse and ultimately more sustainable than those containing introduced plants. I'll talk about some of the research that's been done on how native and introduced plants affect biodiversity of birds, insects, and other animals in our landscapes. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised to find introduced plants, carefully chosen, can be valuable resources for attracting desirable wildlife. We'll also go over some practical landscape design strategies that are guaranteed to create a more environmentally friendly landscape for your wildlife. So let's consider, Are native species, particularly shrubs and trees, the best choice for your gardens? First, let's think about what a native plant is, and a non-native, and an invasive plant. Native plants, you might think, it's an easy recommendation. If it's native, it's always been there. But what does always mean? And how do we know it was there 500 or even 1,000 years ago? Native is a really subjective definition that doesn't really fit into a scientific category very well, and this is why I think there is a lot of discussion and angst about the discourse of native species. So, just so we have a standard to use, we are going to consider a native plant to be something that existed in the United States pre-European settlement. In contrast, a non-native plant would be one that came here afterwards, whether it came here on purpose or whether it came accidentally. We want to take a subset of these non-native plants, the invasives, and consider them completely separately. An invasive plant is one that is so destructive to whatever landscape it is introduced to that it decreases biodiversity and often creates monocultures. So we have the three categories: native, non-native, and then the invasive species. Now let's consider some of the perceptions and misperceptions some people may have about native species. First, we know that the rate of extinction of species, whether it's total extinction or just local extirpation, is increasing, and a lot of that loss is being blamed on the use of non-native species, especially invasives. A second misperception some people have is that only native species can fill ecological roles. An example of this might be looking at some of our native berry-bearing plants, and that birds can only eat berries from native species. A lot of our invasive species also happen to have seeds spread by birds. Animal species can adapt to plants that happen to come in and can use those resources. A third perception is that natives are superior to introduced plants for a lot of different reasons. The first is that they are adapted to the local environment. That means they are not going to have any problems with temperature changes, with water conditions, with pests and diseases because they evolved along with those conditions. Another perception is that there is a reduced maintenance need for native species. If you're in a Mediterranean environment that has dry summers, this means you won't have to use as much water during the summer. Or that if you're in a region that has naturally rich soils, you won't have to use as much fertilizer because the plants there are adapted to these conditions. Remember again, we're talking about native versus non-native areas, not just plants, so urban and suburban versus native soils. The third perception that people have with using non-native species is that they think they will not integrate well with the existing native species, especially animals. Pollinators won't know how to use non-native species. They can only use native species for that purpose. A fourth perception that people have about native species superiority is that native plants give you a sense of place. You see a native plant or you see a native landscape and it reminds you of home. You grew up with that. That's what you enjoy, and there's a very strong pull to that. And a good example for me is the pink coneflower, also known as echinacea, which is a beautiful magenta color that blooms throughout the summer in Illinois and attracts a variety of pollinators and birds. All of this concern about using native species and the loss of biodiversity has got a lot of people in an uproar, and this has caused many groups to start enforcing planting mandates. So, for instance, new developments sometimes, there will be restrictions from the government saying that you have to use a certain percentage of native trees and shrubs when you're planning out these new developments. Many neighborhoods and homeowners associations have said the same thing. You can do what you want with your local landscape, but a certain percentage, or maybe all of it, has to be native plants. Along public roadways, the same types of mandates are seen, and even in some cases there are targeted removal of non-native or invasive species such as teasel. Highway revegetation efforts have often used native plants as a way to bring some of those native species back. If you are doing ecological restoration, you have to use native plants because you are doing restoration back to the way something was. And, of course, there is always the very emotional sense of place. So these are the reasons these planting mandates get put into place, because there's a perception that non-native plants are pushing out the diversity of native plants and animals. Now we will consider a common question. Do native and non-native plants differ in how they affect community diversity? By community diversity, I mean the number of plants, birds, mammals, and insects that a community can support. Many native pollinators have become dependent on introduced non-native plants as their native plants have disappeared. This may surprise you. Actually, a lot of insects are more species-specific and do require native plants, but a lot of other insects are able to adapt to other food sources. And a great example of that is the white-tailed bumblebee, which had not been seen in years. And finally, a very astute insect aficionado, not an entomologist, but someone in the public who just loved watching for bees, caught a picture of one of these white-tailed bumblebees. The bee was on a flower of an introduced invasive blackberry bush, happily taking up pollen and nectar. So, obviously, non-native plants can meet the needs of a lot of insects. In this case, it was an invasive blackberry bush that the insect was feeding from and using. But there are specialist insects, as I mentioned earlier, and they have a very narrow range of affiliated plant species. So, if there are few of trees or shrubs around that those species need, their numbers would be smaller. Keep in mind, though, that many of those specialist insects depend instead on annuals. Not many insects really depend on native trees and shrubs, but they do on annual plants. Generalist insects can feed on a wide range of plant species. They can eat almost anything, and it makes no difference whether the plants are native or non-native. Residential areas and curated botanical gardens have been found to have a much wider diversity of insects than native landscapes. In this case, insect biodiversity as a whole is boosted by having additional non-native species planted alongside native species. In general, urbanization really favors birds that are omnivorous, carnivorous, and granivorous. Gardens provide fruit and nectar, forest types of trees produce seeds, and urban areas just generally have a really wide range of resources. Empty grass lawns are really tough on ground nesting birds and foragers who are really out in the open and can be attacked by predators. Whether they are pets or wild predators, there just isn't a lot of protection. If the only source of water in the area is irrigation, there are no bird baths, ponds, or streams, fewer birds will be found there. Native fruit-eating birds actually increase with increased numbers of plants that have fruit, and as I mentioned before, they can spread invasive species and sometimes more prolifically than they can spread native species. Now let's look at animal biodiversity. As we saw with both insects and birds, the more diversity you have in tree and shrub species, even invasives, will diversify habitats where animals can live. Now, let's consider how animal species can be enhanced through species richness and species diversity. First, let's talk about habitat structure. This would be tree canopy cover and vertical diversity going up from the ground, covering plants through the shrubs up to the trees. And then we need to think about how densely things are planted and the diversity of materials you are using. Then consider that the larger your sites are, or more connected your sites are, the more diverse your animals will be. And it's been seen in some situations that people are starting to take down their fences and have their garden and landscapes integrate with their neighbors. And that really helps a lot, especially with some of the smaller animals being able to get back and forth without having to crawl over fences or dig underneath them. Older, larger trees are incredibly important. They provide nesting habitat, protection, food, and they are critical to the success of landscapes. Hollow trees are important too. They make great habitat for a lot of tree nesting species, both insects and birds. Woody debris is very important. There are many insects, mostly beneficial, that are going to colonize that woody debris. Without it, you're just not going to have rich insect diversity. Interestingly, it's the moderately disturbed sites such as suburbs and public green spaces that have the greatest diversity. So everything doesn't have to be perfect and untouched. A little bit of unsettlement is good in terms of bringing in more organisms. Anything that's a profusely flowering species, whether or not it's a native species, will support insects, especially pollinating insects, and anything that either eats the flowers or the fruits throughout the season. So, profusely flowering things throughout the season will increase animal diversity. Let's return to the initial question. Are native species of plants the best choice for home gardens? I think you can infer that the answer is not so cut and dry. A lot of gardeners would prefer to use native plants and natives only, and that's because they believe that this is better for local wildlife. But it turns out that the science does not support this viewpoint. What the science supports is that the vertical structure all the way up from the ground to the canopy is what's important for maintaining wildlife, whether native plants are present or non-native plants are present. So my advice to you is that you should absolutely use natives as much as you can. If you can't use native plant species, use plants that give you that vertical structure that provides ecological support for wildlife, and you'll have a sustainable landscape. There are some other important practical considerations to keep in mind. Remember, urban and suburban areas are not natural, and only native areas are natural. Native species are often not adapted to those urban and suburban conditions. In their place, we will need to use these introduced non-native species to provide the ecological benefit that the native species can no longer provide. And remember that introduced does not mean invasive. In fact, looking at all of the various introduced species, very few of them have actually become invasive in our landscapes. Most of them are neutral or mutually beneficial in some way. So we can use these introduced species to enhance garden and landscape biodiversity. First of all, there are some great selection strategies when you're thinking about urban versus your native soils. Air pollution might be an issue if you are in more of an urban environment. It may be drier in your urban or suburban environment than it may be in a native area. Heat can be higher in an urban environment, and light can also be brighter in an urban environment. The soils may also be completely different than what used to be there centuries ago. Secondly, let's think about selecting plants, diversifying our palette of what's acceptable. What we need to do is identify the roles that we need to play in the plant community. Think about things like food value. Do you have the types of plants that will provide the nectar, the fruit, the leaves that you need for your animals that you plan to bring in as part of your landscape? What about nesting value? Do you have enough diversity, both in terms of nesting cavities or branches, as well as where in the landscape it occurs, if it's near the ground or if it's higher up in the canopy? Structural diversity is part of that. You need to have good structure, and you need to have things at all levels, and it's pleasing to the eye as well as useful to habitat and for nesting. And then species diversity with a larger palette. You don't need to stick with just natives. Natives are great and should be used whenever you can, but consider so many of those well-behaved non-native plant species that are available that can provide many benefits that are necessary to bring in your insects, birds, and other desirable wildlife. I've come up with some management strategies that you can use in your landscape to help you get these wonderfully habitat-friendly, wildlife-pleasing types of landscapes. First of all, you want to plant alternative resources before you take anything else out. So let's say you have some invasive species, like a berry bush, that you want to remove. Something else that flowers profusely, has lots of berries or fruit, and provides nesting habitat. You want to plant something like this to take place of those plants before you remove them. Birds oftentimes will depend on invasive species for their food, and if you take those out before you plant something else, you're going to have problems retaining your birds. When you're looking at nesting, make sure when you are taking out an invasive species, wait until wintertime. You can see more easily that way because the leaves will be gone, and you won't be disturbing nesting birds if you take them out in the winter as opposed to the spring or summer. One of the most important things you can do is maintain a vertically diverse assemblage of species, including trees, shrubs, and perennial flowers, so you have that vegetation structure which many animals need in terms of having their perfect habitat. You should plant trees in diverse groups rather than these nice rows of trees that are very pleasing to us aesthetically, but they aren't that good in terms of providing lots of habitat. You've probably seen beautiful pictures of lawns with rows of trees that lead down the road, and it's a great symmetrical picture and it makes us feel good, but it's pretty barren in terms of being able to provide good habitat. You want to enhance the vegetation at the landscape edges, where you go from lawn to flower beds or from flower beds to tree understory. These edges are really rich in animal diversity. And those are kind of buffer strips. Just leave them alone and let them be kind of messy. They're wonderful for maintaining insect and bird diversity. As much as you can, leave dead wood alone. It may not be very attractive, but it's very useful for nesting habitat, and there are a lot of beneficial insects that will colonize dead wood. Tree stumps can be drilled with holes to allow bees, katydids, and other insects overwinter. Next on our laundry list of what you can do to make your environment more wildlife friendly is to reduce the managed, open lawns when you can. Those are just smorgasbords for predators waiting to pounce on ground nesting birds and other unprotected wildlife. You also want to reduce soil erosion and compaction by using a woody organic mulch to help keep soil in place and enrich it as well. And just in general, you want to adopt less intrusive practices. You want a little bit of mess. Sure, it's fine to cut away dead portions of branches or things that are obstructing your view, but don't micromanage every single part of your landscape. Let it be a little messy. Your wildlife will love you for it. When we discovered what garden science tells us about the relative benefits of native versus non-native species, we can make more informed decisions in choosing plants. The judicious use of both native and non-native species in home gardens and landscapes can increase animal biodiversity, especially beneficial species. We can even provide sanctuary for introduced plant species whose native range is threatened by agriculture or urbanization. And by using a robust plant palette, we can create diverse habitats through the layering of trees and shrubs and smaller plants. A rich mixture of plant species in your gardens and landscapes can become a haven for desirable wildlife, as well as for you and your family.